Dobro vam večer, gledate Oko ekonomije, moje ime je Vesna Damjanić-Branković. Od naših unutrašnjih problema često zaboravimo na to da Srbija nije izolovano ostrvo i da globalne promjene i događaje itekako kreiraju našu i sudbinu naše zemlje. I upravo zato ćemo večeras razgovarati o tome gde je Srbija danas u svetskom, političkom, ekonomskom i geostrateškom poretku, a koji nam se menja pred očima i zbog ukrajinske krize. Koje lekcije smo naučili u posljednjih 100 godina od početka Prvog svjetskog rata? Kolika pretnje su globalne klimatske promjene, a koliko se o njima razmišlja pre nego što se dogode katastrofe poput poplava u našoj zemlji? Da li ekonomske krize nemaju kraja, već samo menjaju svoje oblike? O tim pitanjima ću razgovarati sa mojim gostima, a to su
Đefri Saks, svetski ekonomista koji je bio poznat kao zagovornik šok terapije, brzopoteznog smanjenja inflacije nemilosrdnim sredstvima, a koji je 1989. savjetovao i Antu Markovića. Saks se sada bavi izazovima globalnog razvoja. On je specijalni savjetnik Ban Ki-moona, osnivač organizacije Milenijumsko obećanje koja se bavi iskorenjivanjem gladi i siromaštva u svetu i član je Beogradskog centra za međunarodnu saradnju i održivi razvoj. Đorđ Fridman, američki politikolog, osnivač i direktor privatne obaveštajno-analitičke organizacije Stratfor, koja se bavi geostrateškom analizom i predviđanjima. Dr. Fridman je autor 2 bestsellera u kojima navodi glavne izazove u svetu, sljedeća dekada i sljedećih 100 godina. Jjeремиć, predsjednik Centra za međunarodnu saradnju i održivi razvoj. Za predsjednika Generalne skupštine Ujedinjenih nacija Jjeремиć je izabran 2012. godine na direktnom izjašnjavanju od strane većine zemalja. Tokom svog mandata igrao je važnu ulogu u kreiranju agende Ujedinjenih nacija o održivom razvoju za period posle 2015. godine. Jjeремиć je bio šef srpske diplomatije i savjetnik srpskog predsjednika.
Good evening, Mr. Saks, Mr. Fridman, Mr. Jjeремиć. Thank you very much for coming at the RTS. I apologize if we didn't mention something important from your professional biography, but you are all gathered here in Belgrade because of the conference dedicated to the First World War or the Great War and the lessons we learned. So, Mr. Jjeремиć, you were host of this conference, and I want to know what lessons we didn't learn from First World War until now.
Well, first of all, the 100th anniversary of the outbreak of the Great War has special significance for this country because Serbia was part of the developments that led to the outbreak of hostilities, and this was one very important part of our history. Quarter of our population died at the time. So it's a very important thing for Serbia, but this is a very, very important thing for the world. Because the Great War was in many ways the pivotal event of the modern era. And so many developments in world politics in the last 100 years can be actually traced back to 1914. And then we had a type of a geopolitical situation that in many ways look similar to what we have today. So trying to address what happened, how it all led to a great conflict, and trying to draw lessons from 100 years ago was the motivation for this conference. But it's first and foremost to do with cooperation, engagement, mutual understanding, and trying to guard oneself against pursuing single-minded and selfish agenda that I believe is going to be one of the big lessons that we need to learn 100 years later.
Mr. Fridman, your first time in Belgrade since Cold War. How does it look, Belgrade in Serbia today for you?
Well, I was looking at some of the buildings that have come up that weren't there before. But Belgrade was always a beautiful city. It was a beautiful city to walk in. And I remember being here in the great stone buildings from the Habsburg era, the Ottoman. It is a kind of magical city, particularly at night.
But I want to know, how does it look like a country as a whole, you know, and economically, politically today and at that time period?
Well, during that time period, it was among the most successful communist countries. Yugoslavia was, and Serbia was certainly one of those that participated in it. That doesn't say much, I mean, being one of the more successful communist countries. I think I see now a Europeanism in the region that, you know, shows tremendous promise. A base has been built, and that base has been built on. And in the region, we see Serbia, has a natural leadership role, even though many other countries don't want it, and I think that's emerging.
And for you, Mr. Sacks, you are quite often here, and this conference is held in Belgrade, and it is, as Mr. Јеремиќ said, it is a great war, it's a very big event for our history. And how do you see importance of having this kind of conference today, 100 years ago in Belgrade?
Well, I think it's crucial that we gather here, and Mr. Јeремиќ has brought together some of the greatest thinkers in the world, the historians, for example, who really have studied this, so that we can look at it. And we come here a little bit nervous, actually.
Why?
Because I think the Ukraine crisis and the tensions in the world, tensions in Asia, all make us feel uneasy that maybe the great powers are playing games again. And when great powers play games, lots of people tend to suffer. And we can't have great power politics. We need international law. We need clarity, rules of the game, systems. Because World War I came about because of actions of great powers who distrusted each other. They each mobilized and allied against each other. And then there was suddenly a spiral of violence that went completely out of control. And when we have the Ukraine crisis or other crises around the world right now, at least for me, I feel very uneasy about it.
And for you, Mr. Fridman, world is changing in front of us. Where do you see biggest challenges for today's world, having in mind the Ukraine crisis, first of all?
I would put it this way. From 1914 to 1945, with a truce in between, 100 million people died in Europe. Some in starvation in Ukraine, some in the Holocaust, but it was an extraordinarily destructive period. From 1945 until 1991, Europe was in effect occupied. The decisions on war and peace were made in Moscow and Washington. They were not going to be made in London or Rome. And that was probably good for Europe, because they had not made very good decisions in the past. Since 1991, there has been a great experiment. Can Europe put behind the demons that created the First World War and the Second World War? One way to put it is, can they build institutions, international law, and so on? I would put it differently. Can the very legitimate distrust that European nations had of each other, can the fear that it was not foolish, these are not stupid men and women making these decisions, can that be put behind? The great test of this moment is whether the history of Europe will continue as it did before, or whether or not the period from 1991 onward can be continued.
Yeah, but who will be most responsible to pass this test?
Well, it really is a question of, can the Europeans form a coalition with Russia to manage the situation? Or will Russia and the European peninsula confront each other with the United States being drawn in?
Could I pick up one thing that Ģorģ said, which is he talked about men and women making decisions. One thing about the conference that makes perfectly clear: there were no women making decisions. It was all men that were leading.
What about Angela Merkel today?
No, at the time.
At the time, okay.
I wasn't certain if I was leading anybody else.
Yeah,
so
but I think that it's really an important point. By the way, these were men who had their macho.
But if we put in today's situation,
feelings, and maybe there'll be a little bit more balance in our modern time.
Well, having seen Indira Gandhi and Angela Merkel, I'm not sure that we can draw any comfort from the fact that women rule. Look, human beings live with distrust of each other. There's this idea that if we only understood each other better, we wouldn't have this. My view is I really understand some people. I'd be more frightened than before. The issue for Europe now is a very profound one, which is, can it manage its own internal affairs without drawing other countries in? And that question is to be asked about Germany. And that question is asked about Poland, asked about Serbia as well, which is, you have a crisis that has developed. Can it be managed? or will it go back to the form it did before?
Yeah, for Serbia, Mr. Јеремиć, it is important to say that Serbia stays neutral in this conflict regarding Ukraine crisis. How do you comment on that?
Well, obviously, Serbia's position vis-a-vis Russia and vis-a-vis Europe has its historical dimension, and but in this concrete case, there's a very important responsibility coming up for Serbia, and this is the chairmanship of the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE.
Which is only in Ukraine today.
Well, that's the only organization, international organization, that is active in the context of Ukraine. And Serbia is already a part of the chairing Troika, and on January 1, Serbia is going to take over the leadership of this organization. It has to remain neutral, even if we didn't want to. It is actually our responsibility as an incoming chairman of the OSCE.
Yeah, but is it possible on long run? You know, having in mind all pressures from Washington, from Brussels, from other side, and from the other side from Moscow, to stay neutral?
Well, I think it's possible. At this point, Serbia has no direct role in it beyond this very important chairmanship that's going to be held. We don't know yet what's going to happen. I mean, we cannot assume that this is going to be a repeat of the Cold War or anything else. We simply know that there is a serious problem that's developed, not just between the United States and Ukraine, but between and Russia and the Ukraine, but also with Poland, with Romania, with other countries that are uneasy. Serbia serves an enormously important purpose by not getting involved. First, because it has minimal role to play, and secondly, because one thing that the region needs is an honest broker, aside from the United States, who's not always the best broker in these circumstances. We think of Switzerland frequently as playing this role, but Switzerland won't play the role here, but a country that has been steeled in war and conflict and has built a liberal democracy that can survive, I think this country may have something to attribute on that level.
For you, Mr. Sakс, do you think that on long run Serbia can stay neutral and among all these pressures from European Union and Russia?
Well, I think the hope is that these pressures can be reduced at this point. Ukraine has had a successful presidential election. I think that's a good thing. There is now an elected president who can deal with Russia and try to work out some of the outstanding issues right now. They're talking these days about gas. They're talking about, I think, serious matters. What I think Russia has seen is that if it pushes very hard and destabilizes Ukraine, no matter what, Russia will suffer consequences because economic ties, new investments, and so forth will absolutely be blocked. And most of Russia's business leaders were saying, stop, we don't want to rupture relations. This is not the Cold War era. This is an era where we're completely intertwined. There's hundreds of billions of dollars of foreign investment from Western Europe into Russia. And Russia does not want to lose all of that connection.
Yeah,
so I'm hoping...
Let me just pick up on this one just for a second. I mean, looking back, because we have been talking about history in the last couple of days, this wouldn't be the first time that our country takes a neutral position vis-a-vis two big blocks of influence. This is not for me to advocate the return to non-alignment. Serbia has a very firm European path right now. But actually serving as an honest broker, especially within the framework of the OSCE, which gives us the mandate to do so, put us in a position to be able to leverage, in a way, our special relationship that we've had for a very long time with Russia. This is a relationship of trust. And as a country that has a relationship of trust with Russia and aspiration, and it's solidly on its way to Europe, I believe that we can help to an extent.
But, Mr. Fridman, just to ask you, because you have said that Serbia is part of borderland together with Turkey and Baltic countries, which makes security shields against Russia. How can we understand that territorially we are not there?
I would understand borderland as a border area between two spheres, between the European peninsula and Russia itself. There are many countries that are part of this. This is not necessarily a shield. It could be a battlefield. It could be many things. But I want to talk about something Đefri said. It's true that Russia has serious economic interests at stake. It's not clear to me that they're at risk. The German position on this affair has made it very clear that they're not prepared to breach these relationships. There's something else that really, to be fair to the Russians. The Russians thought they had a promise from the West that no part of the former Soviet Union would be included in NATO, not included in the EU. This fell to the wayside with the Baltic countries when they were included. The Russian view is that, look, the neutralization of Ukraine, one in which it will not be included in the Western institutions, but can trade with the West and so on, is perfectly acceptable. And they look at the events of trying to draw Ukraine into the EU as a question of what is the motive of the West. Now, the Germans are very quickly, having been the one to draw them, backed off and said they're not. What is happening here is that the Russians have legitimate fears about the future of Ukraine. They have a vested interest. They have been prepared to tolerate a great deal of internal, but who Ukraine allies with matters to them, as Mexico's alignment would matter to the United States. For the Poles and the Romanians, the behavior of the Russians in Ukraine seems to be a preface to more Russian actions because they've seen Russian behavior of this way. What you have is a collection of fears. None of the fears are irrational. None of them are illegitimate. When you look at the history that each has suffered, the Russians, what they've suffered, what the Poles have suffered, these are very real, legitimate fears. The question is there a way to persuade them that this time is different when it's not clear to me that it is? So I think we have to look at this, right? Regardless of what the businessmen in Moscow say, and I know that many of them oppose this, the position of the Russian government and the security apparatus is very different. Regardless of what people are saying in the EU about the Polish position and the Romanian position, this is the government's position. Now the question is, there are multiple fears and hopes. There's a hope for a prosperous interchange. There's a fear of a reigniting of the past. This is why I brought up the past conflict, 1914, 1945. Europe has a very bad history. Yeah. It does not have the right to assume that everything will go well.
Yeah, but who will pay highest price because of this crisis in Ukraine? Which country? Economically.
If this crisis intensifies, Russia will pay a very high price.
Even they have now good connection, good agreement with China in energy.
In this world, if you isolate yourself from a large part of the world, just by actions which provoke reactions, it's not good. And the idea that one chooses a few countries, those are who we align with, the others we don't care. That is an old way of thinking, and I think for Russia this is actually in the end going to be widely understood. I do not believe we're going to a new Cold War. I don't believe that these are unsolvable problems. I don't believe we should be governed by our fears. That's what World War I started with, being governed by fears. If you go with the worst case scenarios on all sides, you end up with the worst case. It becomes self-fulfilling. So I think at this point we should really not view these countries as pawns in the middle of a great game. There are international rules of proper behavior. There's international law. Ukraine is a sovereign country. It should be respected as such. And Russia and Europe have a lot of mutually beneficial dealings, so much so that they should not let this spiral into
in Europe, they are also not happy
conditions.
Because of this, especially in Germany. German companies, they are a great exporter in Russia.
Absolutely. And whether they want to continue or not, if Ukraine becomes more destabilized, they will not continue. It's not a matter of policy. It's a matter of the risks and the conflict and the sanctions and others making them pull back from deals. And so all I'm saying is that this is a difficult and frightening period. It is not to be taken lightly, but it means that we should be working hard to help get back to a normal, mutually beneficial, cooperative situation, and a lot of people on all sides of this want that.
Yeah, but at the same time, in Europe, we had elections, and there is a significant rising of anti-European Union parties and radical left parties. Is that a little bit frightening for the Europe itself, politically?
What is frightening is that the Europeans didn't do the things they needed to do to prevent this rise. The divergence between Southern Europe and Germany had, and various other economic problems, had an inevitable political outcome that we're now seeing. I think there was a level of complacency in Europe that its institutions were so firmly embedded that a major movement challenging it couldn't arise. This is not yet a major movement, but it could be the beginning of one. The problem here is that, as in the case of Europe, everybody is not benefiting equally from these institutions. Some people are, some people are not, and there is a divergence not between people who all benefit from this, but to those who do and don't. I'd like to speak to Ukraine and the different perception. And the American perception, the European perception, is that the Russians, unable to withstand a regime change, a government change, a legitimate thing, engage in aggressive actions against the Ukraine. The Russian view is that the Americans and the Germans engineered the unseating of a legitimately elected president because he would not agree to signing an agreement with the Europeans, sponsored particularly by the Germans, which was perfectly his right. The problem here is that not that there is an unwillingness to compromise, but there's two different narratives. Neither one of them is preposterous. And when you have those two different narratives show up, okay, then the question of how you solve it, how you reconcile, becomes very, very complex.
Where do you see a solution? Because you're quite good anticipating things and predicting things. How do you see end of this crisis?
I think if I were Russian, I would have a great deal of trouble trusting the West after what happened in Kiev. Because I would say, why was it so important to do this? Why was my fears not something you could take into account? What are you really doing? And let's not speak of the West, because...
If you're from America, as you are.
Well, if I'm from America, I look at this and say, I don't know what's going to happen. If I'm from Poland or Romania, I say, I've seen this happen before. What comes next? So each person, each nation, each person as well, has different interests. The business community has one interest in the European Union. It is not the same as other social segments.
In that case, what Serbia should think?
I was about to say this. If I was Serbian, and I actually am Serbian, then
you are.
The only thing that I believe we can do is to watch, to be very attentive. To continue with our close relations with both sides of this divide, because we have deep vested economic and other interest in working very closely with both.
Because of economic impacts, we are close to the European Union, close to Russia.
We're working very closely with Russia, especially in the field of energy. We are working very closely with Europe in terms of industrial production here. We're on our way to joining the European Union. There's absolutely no way, in my opinion at least, in which we can viably position ourselves except, not just like waiting and watching what's going to happen. Being an active protagonist in diplomatic initiatives, especially, as I said, through our OSCE chairmanship, but trying to do our best not to deteriorate our relationship with either of the sides, because it's simply an untenable position. Perhaps it's not as drastic as it was in the case of Ukraine, because in Ukraine it was very obvious that there is no long-term political or economic sustainability without a country being able to work very closely with both. It's perhaps not as manifest in the Serbia's case, especially if you look at a map. But if you go deeper and if you analyze deeper our political and economic situation, I think it is an imperative, as a matter of fact, that we continue being able to work with both.
I think Đefri's point is well taken, that there has to be some sort of settlement. The biggest hope is that a country like Serbia and a country like Germany refuse to play the game, that they stay outside of it and they try to influence
But
Poland,
obviously we have this balance of powers. So
I don't think we're there yet as having a balance of power. We have very anxious countries like Poland and Romania, very anxious countries like Russia, countries like Germany, who's manifesting its anxiousness by not being willing to do this. It's all very fragmented at this point. I mean, the idea that we have settled into a Cold War, I think, is wrong, and I think Đefri's quite right. That we could settle into a Cold War is, I think that's a real possibility. But I think the questions that have to be answered are, what will Germany do? Will the Poles sustain the position that they've taken? Will the United States become involved, which is not clear yet that they will? What will Serbia do? And I say Serbia as one of several European countries that does not have to get involved. So nothing is clear yet. But at this point, it's extremely important for us to understand. I mean, to me, the problem is not fear. The problem is not understanding the other guy's fear. And in this case, both sides have legitimate fears that have to be understood, and it can't become a cartoon, the bad one, the good one.
And in meantime, we have another problem, and which we are facing here in Serbia very well. I don't know is that correct word, because climate change, that's another huge topic in the world. And for you, Mr. Јеремиć, do we really realize the importance of climate change? But imagine that I ask you this before floods in Serbia.
Well, if you asked me before the floods in Serbia, I'd be probably saying the same thing, because I was involved very closely in sustainable development negotiations in the United Nations. Serbia was presiding over the General Assembly of the UN at a critical time where a framework for these negotiations was set. So I was a part of this discussion even before. But I think it is now, after these floods in Serbia, and these are the most horrible this is the most horrible natural disaster that we've experienced in probably 100 years. I think it is now very obvious to the wider public that this thing is happening. Now, this thing that happened in Serbia is actually happening every day in other parts of the world. And I think that the evidence is overwhelming that this thing is going on, and that the only way to try and address it is to real engagement and with setting the priorities right. And in my opinion, one of the most pressing priorities for humanity in the coming years is how to sit together and to address this issue, and how to work in harmony.
But who will sit together? If we have in mind this Ukraine crisis and relations between Russia and West, so who will sit together and talk about climate change?
Well, there's a plan right now, and it involves all of the UN this coming year. When Mr. Јeремиć was president of the General Assembly, he put this into motion that by 2015 there should be an agreement worldwide on setting basic goals for sustainable development. That means harmonizing the economy and the environment. And so this is the negotiation underway that Mr. Јeремić started as president of the General Assembly. And there's supposed to be an agreement also in Paris in December 2015 on climate change. And it's absolutely true that most of the world, most of the time, ignores this. But then every part of the world is being faced with this tragic destruction that Serbia has just experienced. We were shocked by what we could see.
So what will be first test for sustainable development?
So you'll watch. The United States will start making statements even today and this coming week on climate change. Then China has to make statements. These are the big two countries in this regard. European Union, Russia, India. This is another great power situation where the whole world, Serbia as part of it, is facing the consequences of these mega energy owners and producers. They have to take responsibility. And the world has to say, look, we don't want to be devastated by floods. We don't want people dying in large numbers. We don't want our country wrecked by massive flooding or droughts or heat waves or other terrible natural disasters. The big parties to this who own the coal, the oil, the gas, they have to stop. They have to stop misbehaving and get to a reasonable energy policy.
Do they have time to think about it, that having in mind that we have an economic crisis 5 years ago started and there is still no end? Or there is end but we have a new crisis?
Well, the fundamental question is, what is the price of all this economically? Everything has a price. If we assert that this crisis is so extreme that humanity is at stake, then any price is worth it. That's a hard case to make.
Crisis with climate change.
If the crisis with climate change is so great that humanity's existence is at stake, then obviously any price is worth paying. Short of that, you do the benefit analysis. I mean, what do we give up? Floods. What do we get? And I think one of the problems is at these meetings is everybody has wonderful arguments to make against climate change. Quantifying the cost and who will bear it and how it will be borne is not nearly as clear. And whether there is the political will, not among the elites, but among masses who will pay the price in standard of living, potentially, because I really don't know what the cost is, to go through this. I mean, there really is the issue. Until we put the cost on the table, we haven't had the conversation.
Yes, but today in Serbia, a huge question is the floods and the damages. So will, according to your opinion, United Nations will help us to deal with this problem?
Well, basically, on a strategic level, the United Nations is the only international institution that has the convening power and the legitimacy for this issue to be addressed on a planetary scale. So we're talking about a strategic solution that has to come about through complex negotiations in the coming months. Now, when it comes to this particular crisis in Serbia and alleviation of the hardship that has been inflicted on this country in the last few months, I understand that there will be an engagement by the Secretary General. There will be an engagement by a number of European countries, and we're working very closely with Russia and the European Union in order to get the things going. But
will you personally help?
Well, as a matter of fact, there was an effort at this conference to collect funds, and it was very successful. The announcement is going to be made today. I'm very grateful to the participants of this conference who have positively responded to our appeal to make a donation.
We need help, and we are almost at the end. So I want to ask you, Mr. Sacks, question, $1 million question: is there end of this economic crisis?
The good news is that there's a lot of potential for world development, but we have to do it in a smart way. The conflicts, like Ukraine, they will hurt, definitely. If we continue in the wrong direction on energy policy, there's no future. But if we move to a sustainable development course, then the whole world could have a new wave of economic growth. That's what we're really aiming for. Choose the right direction, one that really can make sense over a 20-year period, and that will unleash a lot of economic development.
What small countries as Serbia could expect regarding getting out from economic crisis and recovering?
Small countries have to raise their voice. A small country can have a president of the General Assembly who makes a loud voice.
But 6 months ago, when you were here,
Serbia by itself can't change the world economy. Serbia has to say to its neighbors, to Europe, to Russia, to others, let's get on the right course, stop the bickering and the fighting, and find the cooperative approach.
Yeah. But 6 months ago, when you were here at this same studio, you have said that for Serbia as country, it's most important to be competitive.
Yes, well, that's true of any country. It has to take care of itself in world markets. It has to be able to
especially
export.
take care about young people and for young people
Absolutely.
to stay in Serbia.
Yes, but I'm saying that is absolutely Serbia's main job internally, is have a competitive economy, be able to export, earn Serbia's way in the world. But Serbia also has a role to play in helping the world as a whole to be functioning.
So you don't suggest any more shock therapy like 20 years ago?
When you need shock therapy, I recommend it. If you have hyperinflation, I can help you get it under control.
Luckily, we don't. Luckily, we don't have it.
So the medicine goes with the disease, and sometimes shock therapy is needed, sometimes it's not.
Mr. Fridman, what would you suggest Serbia to improve position and to reputation and to attract more investors here, that people could have benefits?
Well, I think as a small country, you really have to examine your relationship to big countries. I heard everything was said about alignment of interests, but the fact is, it's not clear that Serbia's interests are aligned with, for example, Germany's. Germany is a massive exporter. You are trying to find your balance as an industrial power. How does that align? There probably is a point of alignment. It's not clear that Germany will pay the price they would have to. It's not clear that Serbia would pay the price. The problem of the world is that there are very different interests, and they're very legitimate interests, and they don't harmonize. If you're lucky, you can keep this from becoming war or international trade wars or things like that. But I think my view is that the problem, there are no magnificent solutions. Avoiding the worst is something that human beings can do. Serbia is now avoiding the worst and maybe can hope for better. That's not a bad place to be in this world with everything else that's going on. But as to what you do with Ukraine is you avoid it. What do you do with the European crisis? You try to limit its impact on you. You don't expect the entire world to change to accommodate you or each other. They don't. It is to find that place where you can pursue your interests and not have a massive dependence on the interests of others. They may not be the same.
Yeah, but I know that you have good information and that you are anticipate very well. So for Serbia, is our role on the right position? You know, are we standing okay in this context of changing politically, economically, geostrategically?
I was deeply aware of 1999 and the war. I measure things by where you were and where you are now.
And
I like where you are now compared to where you were. There has been a massive evolution. No one can guarantee your future. The best you can do is identify what you need and protect it. But certainly the trajectory of Serbia, compared to what most people thought it would be in 2000, 2001, has been surprising and positive. And I think that's very good.
And Mr. Јеремиć, what lessons we did learn from Great War today until today, and especially regarding Ukraine crisis and economic crisis?
Well, it was very eloquently put by my friends this evening. But in short, Serbia has to guard itself very carefully. And just like Mr. Fridman said, we need to understand the world that is surrounding us in order to align our interest with the resulting interests so that it doesn't come to our harm. Sometimes in our history we have not understood very well what was going on in the world, and we paid a heavy price. In this world, in today's multipolar and globalized world, we need to understand it. And part of this conference was to try and understand the world as it is, so that we better position ourselves in it.
I hope we will have better position Serbia and the world. Thank you very much for coming at RTS. It was an honor. Hvala vama, poštovani gledalci, što ste bili sa nama. Ostanite i dalje uz vaše RTS i verujte našim očima. Hvala svima.